Thank you very much.
Oh.
So my name is Katie Lowe. I am the Assistant Librarian for Instruction at Indiana University East. Indiana University East is a regional campus of the IU system. We'll be talking about why that's important in just a minute. That actually comes up later. But I want to start out with a quote from Kimberly Grambo, who is a recent graduate of UPenn. Fake news that falsely and negatively portrays a particular ethnic, racial, or religious group implies an unworthiness of citizenship or even dehumanizes members of these groups. History is littered with violent examples demonstrating why society should aim to prevent these effects. And there's a reason I'm starting out with this. I'm starting with this particular quote not only because of its timeliness, but because it's sometimes really hard to remember why we fight fake news in the first place. It's a disheartening battle. It's one with no end in sight, but there's very important reasons why we must keep up our efforts. Our students, whether minority or not, are vulnerable to misinformation. And we've seen misinformation on COVID and race and the protests going on right now. We've seen how misinformation has actively skewed social responses to public health and our own shared humanity. So I fight fake news because I believe it's one of the most important things that I can do towards a more just and more fair world. And it's one that it's a world that would value everyone, and it's a battle that I am equipped to deal with. And so are you as information professionals. While many people claim that libraries are intended to be safe or neutral spaces, we also know that misinformation is usually biased, racist, misogynistic, anti-Semitic, homophobic, and it should be no surprise that we have seen an uptick in hate crimes that appears to coincide with the public's new perception and new awareness of fake news. So we have work to do. And as challenging as it is, it's valiant work. And as information professionals, we are equipped in a way that many people aren't to fight this. So this is our charge. This is what we're focusing on today is we are fighting fake news. It is important work. Our students need it. Our students need us. So with that in mind, what exactly is fake news? You've probably seen this image a number of times. This is the yellow press from 1910, and the figure in red is supposed to be William Randolph Hearst. So William Randolph Hearst, of course, was a major New York publisher. He was the New York Herald and fomented a lot of what we would consider yellow journalism, hence the yellow newspapers. That's where the term comes from. It's fake news of a kind, but it's important to note that fake news has changed significantly since 1910. There's a couple different definitions of fake news we're going to talk about. The first is Hunt Alcott and Matthew Gentzko's, which is a very basic definition. News articles that are intentionally and verifiably false and could mislead readers. It's kind of couched. They've done a lot of the foundational research when it comes to this recent tide of fake news. Their extremely basic definition here, which is in one of the earliest articles on fake news in the 2016 election, it doesn't really go far enough. You'll notice that there's some key things missing here. David Lazer's definition from 2018 incorporates that fake news mimics actual news. It's meant to look like real news. It has the form of it, but it doesn't have the same intention. So news is meant to inform. We have this idea as a collective society of what news is supposed to be. It's supposed to be informational. It's supposed to give us up-to-date information on things going on in the world, in our communities, in our neighborhoods. Fake news subverts that model and sucks us in by trying to be something that it really isn't and cannot be. He also explains that fake news doesn't have the rigor attached to it that traditional media does. So there are no newsrooms, there are no fact checkers, there's no one making sure that things are correct. There is no there's actually no desire for these things as well, nor the infrastructure to create that kind of desire. Fake news is sheer mimicry and nothing else. And then our third one here is Peter Turnberg from 2018. And he adds the third part of what the modern fake news is. So we've got the first two definitions that qualify the false and the mimicry part. But the thing that makes fake news really insidious today is the virality of it and the echo chamber effect. So social media has exacerbated fake news by allowing it to spread rapidly within small groups. So we think about Facebook groups that are anti-vaxxers or focused on fringe theories. But as Turnberg notes, the setup of social media groups amplifies messages in a way that other forums don't. It's one thing to hear some quack on YouTube or maybe in your Facebook feed or even one of your relatives saying something that's clearly factually false. It's another thing, however, when potentially hundreds of people in your chosen peer group, which is what a Facebook group is essentially, it's another thing when all of them are saying the same thing. So this creates the echo chamber effect where you're listening to the same information over and over again, but the echo chamber also blocks out accurate information at the same time. So as someone who does believe that vaccines are really powerful and wonderful things, and we have had 2 diseases eliminated in my lifetime, which is pretty remarkable. And that would be smallpox and rinderpest. Rinderpest was eliminated in 2010. We have 2 diseases that no longer exist because of vaccines. And it's very hard to get through an echo chamber to explain why that's remarkable and why we need to keep working with vaccines to improve them even further. So that's the problem with echo chambers, the virality of it. This is why we care about fake news now. It's not that fake news is new. It's not. Some of the earliest examples date back to 6th century CE, when Emperor Justinian was the target of a smear campaign. And there's other earlier examples as well. But it's not the age of fake news. It's not the fact that it's a new phenomenon. We're experiencing it in a way that we haven't seen it before. And therein lies the issue. So where does fake news come from? Well, it comes from fake news sites. So you're probably familiar with Velas Macedonia. If you followed any of the stories exposing some of the fake news in the 2016 campaign. If not, I'm happy to fill you in. Velas Macedonia is, well, it's not in the US. And the average worker in Velas Macedonia makes $426 a month. The city is known for pottery and has been for 500 years. So you're a high school student, and this is mostly high school and early college students. You're a high school student who speaks really good English. You've never been to the US, but you know who's running for president. According to CNN, the average fake news writer in Velas Macedonia can make $2,500 a month. So you compare $426 for your parents, you can make $2,500. I kind of know what you're doing for a living. So there's an attempt to crack down on that. There has been some well-known efforts to curtail some of that on the state level. Poynter Institute has been following this. However, we have to keep in mind that there's going to be a way for it to persist. And so it's really still contingent on us to be able to identify it and teach others how to identify. We also, and where's that money coming from? That's probably a really good question. I can't see the comments right now, but I'm going to assume that question is being asked. Google AdSense is very reticent about revealing the numbers regarding their ad clicks, and it's mostly advertising on these sites. But you can take a guess, it can be anywhere from a couple cents to up to $1. And that's one of the ballpark figures I've read. So if you have a story that's shared 250 times and you're making $1 a click, that's $250. That's pretty interesting money. And again, those numbers have not been verified explicitly by any organization. They're just what I can find. It's fiendishly difficult to find anyone who's going to reveal those numbers. So again, social media is another conduit for fake news. Everyone spreads fake news. I don't care who you are. I don't care how old you are. I don't care where you're from. At some point, you have or may share a fake news story, no matter how educated you are. That's how I got into this, by the way. I shared a fake news story, and I was bound and determined it was never going to happen again. So 27.4% of voters in the 2016 election visited a fake news site within a month before the 2016 election. And 44% of users get their news from Facebook. So we have almost half of Americans getting their news, their primary news, from social media. 1 out of 2 people. That's an extraordinary number. And that doesn't break down easily by age. It's not just young people getting their news from Facebook. It's people of all ages doing that. So it's a problem on a grand scale, and we're going to discuss that a little bit more in depth later on. How did we get here? Well, it's a problem that it's not a new problem, but something that was exacerbated starting in the 80s. So we're going to talk about the Fairness Doctrine. You've probably heard of it. The Fairness Doctrine is a name attached to a series of FCC regulations that ensured media met the needs of the public. And this meant radio and television. It's really a result of television broadcasting. News broadcasts were not by themselves considered sufficient as informational resources for communities. There had to be other programming as well, like debates and town halls and other such things. Further, if a local broadcast media outlet wanted to gain their FCC license, they needed to perform community assessments and speak with community leaders to determine the demographics of the area they served and develop and present programming that would assist local populations with the problems endemic to them. So you couldn't just talk to, you couldn't just take a survey and say, oh, well, I've got 14% Latino and 5% Asian. You couldn't just block it out that way. You actually had to meet with people in the community and come up with a plan on what to broadcast. So we saw some really interesting results of this in the 60s and 70s. It was pretty wonderful. As a result of communications restrictions and other regulations that were removed, most of what we think of as the Fairness Doctrine was eliminated by 1987. The internet has done nothing to resolve this for a number of reasons. The first is cost. So access to the internet is a monthly recurring cost. I pay $50 a month, plus I have to buy a computer, plus I have to have electricity. And all of these costs recur, except for my computer. And even then, my computer's been wonderful this month. Even at that point, these costs come back. So you have to pay up front every single time that you want access. Television and radio, on the other hand, is a one-time cost. You buy a television set, you buy a radio, and that's it. And these are long-term objects. I've got a radio that I've had for 30 years. It works great. So so cost becomes a major barrier to accessing information, which makes it very difficult for low-income and rural residents to gain information. The FCC broadband deployment report showed that 24 million Americans do not have access to broadband internet at all. And only 65.3% of Americans in rural areas had access to both mobile phone data, 4G, 5G, and broadband. And also another issue that comes up is the issue of shame. Even though libraries and other public locations have access to broadband and high-speed internet, people who are lower income don't always access them because they don't want to ask for them. They don't want to reveal their status as people who are poor. This is true not only for accessing things like the internet, but it's also college admissions, scholarships, public aid, things of that nature. So it's not just a communications issue. This is a broad spectrum poverty issue. Next, community sources of information are disappearing. 13,400 newspaper jobs, just newspapers, were lost between 2007 and 2011. Those are the most recent numbers I can get. These numbers are from the FCC's Informational Needs of Communities report. And unfortunately, they haven't updated this, which is a real shame because we know the losses have been greater since. I know that my own community newspaper lost half its reporting staff in the last 2 years. So we have online and citizen journalism, and Facebook, of course, is a major source of this. I belong to a couple local online citizen sites like that. It's not the high quality journalism that we have come to expect. So it's not fact checked. There isn't an editorial process. There may not be guarantees of anonymity. You don't know who your reporters are responsible to, which is what a standard of ethics that many newspapers and news outlets have. NPR's is particularly good, and I use it for teaching my own students. I absolutely love the standard of ethics from NPR. We don't have that for citizen journalism. We don't have that for most online outlets. So as local newspapers are bought out, my own local newspaper is owned by Gannett, which is the largest newspaper publisher in the country. We have local radio stations consolidating. We have news jobs that are being shed. So we're losing a check on local news. We're losing checks on corruption. We're not being as well informed. And my daily newspaper has both feeds from USA Today and whatever local news is still left to gather with the few reporters that still exist. I'm missing out on a lot of local information. And this can lead not only to worsening outcomes for communities, but it also leads to worse outcomes when it comes to voting. If you're not an informed voter, you're not going to necessarily vote in your own interest because you don't know what to vote for. With the rise of fake news and media discourse, low-income communities suffer. So you've got this perceived gap here that fake news can fill, and social media fills it as well. So Schifele and Krauss explained that a person can be both misinformed and uninformed at the same time. It's a pretty interesting phenomenon. The current coronavirus pandemic emphasizes this very, very well. COVID-19 is a new virus, which the medical community is still relatively unclear about in many ways. There are a lot of things we know, and we know more information every single day. And even today, the World Health Organization put out one set of information and then came back and said, well, you know, they're reconsidering it. To an average news consumer, this may seem like waffling. It may seem like it leads to a sense of misinformation or that something is being hidden. So social media and fake news fill that gap. When that's not the case, it's simply science being a check and balance on itself. So we've got this growing problem with lack of information, lack of news resources, and we still retain this human curiosity to learn things, which maximizes our sense of discomfort when it comes to news at all, and we don't know where to turn. And here's the bad news. You think I don't have bad news yet? Wait, just wait. So many of you are probably familiar with the Stanford History Education Group study from 2016 and 2017. So a study conducted by SHEG demonstrated that 80% of middle school students involved in this particular study, which was in California, could not distinguish between real news stories and sponsored advertising content. This is a big problem. And then later on this year, a New York University study revealed that high school seniors tend to find it much harder to discriminate between accurate and inaccurate news stories. This is true for senior citizens as well. A lot of people think that conservatives fall for more fake news. It is true that it appears, according to Gensko and Alcott, that more fake news is skewed conservative. It's written that way. And according to CNN, the Macedonian fake news writers do tend to write more conservatively skewed fake news because they click on it. However, we should not discount the fact that fake news does target both conservatives and liberals, and that they both share and read fake news. This is not a problem along political lines. It only appears to be. With low-income internet users relying heavily on social media, and we have the echo effect once again coming back, once again, we see this problem exacerbating among all different communities, all different age groups, and to our students here at IU East. I'll give you a little bit of the demographics here, of my community. So IU East is, again, a regional campus of Indiana University. We are located in Richmond, Indiana. Richmond, Indiana is located along I-70, and it's on the Ohio and Indiana border. We serve a 11 county area, and it's mostly rural. It's mostly, Richmond is the largest city in that group. We have about 37,000 people, I believe. 18% of our student body is from Wayne County, which is where IU East is located. So fully 1/5 of our student population is from where the college is located. My numbers here for our free reduced lunch are from 2017, because starting in the 2018 school year, the entire county was granted free or reduced lunch from the state of Indiana. So those are the most recent numbers I have. I can't get anything newer. And lower, and again, we're talking about low income. We're talking about a community that is semi-rural, even though it is the biggest urban area. Wayne County population is 18% seniors and voted 62.7% conservative. So this county went for Trump in 2016. A little bit more, we do have reciprocal tuition for bordering counties in Ohio. So it's pretty much all along the Ohio border from Kentucky to Michigan. We don't get a whole lot of students from that, but we do get enough where it does affect our numbers. 13.1% minority, mostly Latino, 1.7% international, mostly athletes, almost 65% female, and probably most importantly, 85% of our students return to their home communities if they never left. We are a commuter campus. We don't have dorms. Students will drive up to an hour to come to campus. We also have about 58% of our students enrolled online, and those numbers have, of course, increased with COVID-19. So as a result of this, we have students who are very community-oriented, but not campus community-oriented. It creates a unique situation where students are going home as opposed to building a community here on campus. And that gives us kind of a unique charge, even though most colleges do have a responsibility to their communities. Hence our community-driven approach. Students have communities of their own. By treating students as part of their own communities, rather as simply part of a campus, they can apply skills that they learn here and deliver information to those who surround them. So family and friends, but also others in their networks. We have to recognize that students do not live in a bubble, especially on our campus where we have none of that residential housing. Only a fraction of our students live near campus. We've only got a couple apartment complexes nearby. These communities that students develop are familial and public, involve coworkers, involve extended family, online networks, probably multi-generational, multiracial. So we have to recognize that we're not talking about a campus community in the traditional sense. We're talking about a broad spectrum community network style here. It's going to be very different than what a traditional college model is. We also have to recognize that future students may be more information literate. We are paying attention to this problem now. We haven't always done so. I can tell you from my own experience, most of the people I work with said we didn't have to worry about fake news when I was a kid. And when I was a kid either. This is a newer problem. We're starting to pay more attention to it. We're doing more research on it. And this could have long-term outcomes. So I do work with K through 12 when it comes to information literacy as well. As a result of students learning from home, they're having more contact with these communities that they're part of. So we've been at home since March 12th. That was our last day of classes. For the upcoming school year, we will have students working online exclusively from the end of November to mid-February. So roughly flu season, to prevent the spread of COVID-19. As a result, there will be more of that community connectivity for students at home and less on campus. This means even more that we have to look at a community approach as opposed to merely a campus approach. Colleges are also supported by their communities financially through millages, through community partnerships, through tuition dollars. And as a result, colleges should have a responsibility to give back to their communities around them. So this work actually meets with the mission statement of our campus and many others. We're entrenched in our communities. We should be giving back. We should be offering these kinds of programs and services, this kind of information training to as many people as we can, in however many methods that we have possible to us. Last, both of these approaches use the principles behind what's called the illusory truth effect and mere exposure effect. And this is, so illusory truth explains that prior exposure to any statement makes it easier to process in the future. And statements that seem correct but are not are judged to be accurate. Illusory truth, mere exposure means the more that you're exposed to a piece of information, the more likely you are to believe it. So both of these work as echo chamber kinds of things, but we can reverse their effects as well. So these are the 4 solutions that I've been working on to combat misinformation in my community, in our college community. First one is a board game called Fact or Opinion. I can get you a copy of this. It is printable on a 11 by 14 sheet of paper, and then the cards themselves print on letter-sized cardstock. This does meet Indiana academic standards. It was designed for a couple different programs that we use here in Indiana's information literacy tools, meant for 3rd through 6th grade. I will tell you that this has been test driven with all of these different audiences and adults. It has high replay ability. So if you would like a copy of this, I do have my contact information at the end of this presentation. Get a hold of me, I'll make sure you get a copy. Next, I have a radio show, which is on hold because of COVID-19. We don't have the ability to do community broadcasting through this particular station. I have done interviews with the broadcaster since. Every single week, I do a roughly 2-minute spot on a new piece of information literacy. So I talk about everything from checking sources to implicit bias, to confirmation bias, to Forer effects and Barnum statements. You name it, I'll cover it. And I cover something new every single week. This reaches mostly adults between ages of 25 and 65. So it's mostly an adult demographic. It's a local radio station, so our range is limited, but I will tell you, I get some pretty good feedback from it. Third one is the Fake News LibGuide. This is the LibGuide that kind of was shot around the world. It's been profiled by ALA in the past. SpringShare profiled it last year as part of their ALA presentation. It's been viewed over 103,000 times around the world. I have received email from Dubai, Dublin, Shanghai, almost all the 50 states. And I've worked with student researchers in Ireland discussing fake news. So this has been really cool. It came out as a result of a class where I needed material to present and I didn't have anything. So I literally made this up within like 12 hours and it's grown since then. It's a pretty remarkable document. It addresses all audiences, but I hear mostly from high school and community colleges. And you're welcome to use this as well. I can get you the address for that. Everything on there, all the graphics are mine. You're welcome to adapt and share as needed. The fourth one, I go on tour. That is my car. It has 101,000 miles. I will literally drive within 4 hours to teach fake news. I'm that passionate about it. I currently live in Ohio. I'll go anywhere in Ohio and Michigan, basically. Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan. This is my catitude. And as a result of this tour, I've actually become part of a research project with senior citizens in misinformation. So remember, this is multi-generational. We have to, if we're going to do a community-based approach, it has to be everyone in the community. So we're addressing K through 5 with the game, we're high school and college with the LibGuide, adults with the radio show, seniors like presentations. Like I said, I am part of a research project with IU Northwest, where we're looking at seniors and political affiliation and processing of fake news. This is a brief outline of what those workshops look like. Start with a history of fake news, talk about what makes current fake news different. All of us in our group are just very much in love with the work of Michael Caulfield. I cannot recommend it enough. We've met him, he's wonderful. And we go through his SIFT method, which is stop, investigate the source, find better coverage, and trace claims. It's a very useful method. It's 4 steps. Anyone can do it. I have here listed an example of the kind of stories we use. Guy whose property was being seized left crazy booby traps. That sounds like clickbait. Sounds like a totally ridiculous headline. This story is true. This really happened. And people use the SIFT method to go through and figure out, what's going on. It's a great story to work with. There's others out there, and it challenges your critical thinking skills. We finish up with an assessment of other fake news tools. There's some great games out there because some people learn better through play, and that's great. And last, an assessment which tracks confidence with regard to fake news before and after the presentation. We also collect some demographic information as a result of this study. We were able to complete 1 workshop before COVID-19 shut our project down temporarily. We are planning on restarting as soon as we can. The interesting results were that almost everyone who attended this particular workshop, there were 11 seniors who came, they all voted for Hillary Clinton, which was a finding we did not expect, especially Richmond, Indiana. And yes, that is my cat, and he is judging you, just as he judges me. So, in short, because I think we're almost out of time, this fake news is different. It is not your daddy's fake news. This is more insidious, it's more viral, it's more widespread than usual. Community media erosion is contributing to this problem. Colleges can fix this problem, or at least do something about it in ways that other institutions cannot. Our students are part of their own communities who need access to this information, and therefore community approach to misinformation benefits everybody. It benefits students by working with their communities and networking with everyone together. It becomes a group problem as opposed to one individual problem. We should look at it in global terms as opposed to local terms. There is my contact information. I am open for questions.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for KT's presentation, offered as part of ACRL's Together Wherever virtual event happening all week. I'm Chase Allis, Professional Development and Outreach Specialist here at ACRL, and we'll be starting the Q&A in just a moment. And feel free to go ahead and type your questions in the chat. I just have a few reminders to share with you before we get started on that. As previously mentioned, today's session is being recorded, and we will post the link to the recording on the Together Wherever website. And then after the Q&A, we'll leave the Zoom room open for an additional 20 minutes for optional additional networking and questions. When you depart today's session, you'll see a brief evaluation, and we greatly appreciate your thoughts and feedback. Thank you in advance. And then finally, I'd like to encourage you to visit the Together Wherever space on ALA Connect, where you can continue to ask questions, unpack ideas, and keep the discussion going, as well as use the hashtag ACRLTogether2020 on Twitter. I'll put the link to the Connect space in the chat. And now on to the questions. KT, I have a couple from earlier in the presentation. All right. For your radio program, is there any chance past episodes could be released in a podcast format? People are interested in hearing those.
Well, we're trying to figure out how to do that. My radio station that I work with does not have the ability to do previous broadcasts. However, I've saved every single one of my recordings. So if I'm hoping to get something out, it might be on something like YouTube. I have a YouTube channel, so it might be something like that. But we're talking about it actively. The person I work with and I are trying to come up with an idea of how to do this.
Great. Another question. What do you think about people who claim that factcheck.org or Snopes, et cetera, are all biased or fake themselves?
Yes, there are some people who think that. And unfortunately, there comes a point where you have to pick your battles. And this is where mirror exposure effect comes into play. There is a term called nerd of trust that I absolutely love. It was invented by a marine biologist in Washington State. It's a really great term. And nerd of trust means you keep presenting good information. You're the person that will always present the good stuff, the factually fact check stuff, the stuff that's always going to be right. You become the trustworthy person. And you have, it's a long game. All of fake news is a long game. So you have to keep posting these things. And there's plenty of evidence that demonstrates that Snopes and fact check are as little biased as possible. Of course, there's always going to be slight bias, but it's about as minimal as possible. You might also note that fact check has won Pulitzers. You know, they're both award-winning fact-checking outlets. And they're both part of the International Fact-Checking Network, which is through the Poynter Institute. So you have to come up with a preponderance of evidence. They might still not believe you, but you just keep throwing it at them anyway.
All right, thank you. Next question, and this one should be quick. What was the NPR resource that you said you use?
The NPR Ethics Handbook, and it's wonderful. It's very, very long. I can't underscore that. It's a gigantic document. It's on the web. And what I do is I teach a first year seminar course, and we have an information literacy portion of this. As part of their assignment, they have to go through the NPR Ethics Handbook, pick out 2 parts of it, and explain why they might be important. Then they have to identify an NPR story of their choice. They can pick anything they want, and tell me how those ethics are put into place. They have to explain how the handbook actually works. They can also do the same thing with another news source. I encourage them to try to find an ethics handbook, although it's surprisingly hard, and some news outlets don't have their ethics handbooks online. That's you, NBC. I really wish you would do that. Really wish you'd post yours. New York Times is also very good. The Association of Newspaper Editors, it's the ASNE, they have a list of 47 different ethics guides for regional newspapers throughout the United States. So you can find these ethics guides. They're wonderful, but it tells you who the news outlet is accountable to, what their practices are, how they handle interviews. It's a really good guiding document. Again, there's no one magic bullet to tell you that a news source is good, but it's a very good sign when you see one of those.
Okay, next question. How do you book your tour dates and create opportunities to introduce things like the board games with community members?
Often they come to me. I've been pretty lucky that way. So some of these resources were created as a result of a community need. So the board game, we work with the local school districts in surrounding 3 counties, which is Union, Richmond, and Randolph County, so north to south. And there are programs where you have college for a day, where you have students coming to the campus and going around and doing things that they would normally do on a college campus. So we have archaeology involved. There's a mock dig. There's a television station on campus, so they get to go do that. When they come to the library, we play the fact or opinion game. And we created this game so that we would be able to present an educational resource to them and allow them to, have a little fun while learning something at the same time. The fact or opinion game uses context to determine whether or not something is a fact or an opinion. So you'll have statements on there like one of my favorite cards is the world's largest rhinestone is 57 pounds and is located in Las Vegas. Fact or opinion? Not true or false. Fact or opinion. It's true, by the way. It's in the Liberace Museum. But the language that I use, I say it is here and it's located there, it's this thing. That tells you it's a fact. Something like chocolate should be free. That is an opinion. I'm using words like should, could, I think, I feel. So it's those kinds of clues that tell you whether or not something is a fact or opinion, not the content itself. And the content is intentionally made up of fairly bizarre things that you would never think of. Like there's a new bacteria that was discovered in 2017 that lives in hairspray. Who knew? Is that a fact or an opinion? It's a fact because I said it as a fact. If I said, I think it's weird that there's bacteria living in hairspray, that would be an opinion. So it's those kinds of clues that do that. So that was a response to a community need, and it's very popular. People really like it. Other things like the radio show, I was approached for that. I was approached to do that. The Fake News LibGuide was a response to a class need. The tours, I get a lot of those bookings from the LibGuide. So it's really one of those things where I don't do as much of the contacting as you would think, although I have made the cold calls myself.
Okay, next question. How do you differentiate to your audiences between misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation?
Well, they're all related. They're all related distinctly. And I actually have that answer written down somewhere. And let's see if my notes actually printed out on this. They did not. So misinformation is unintentional. Disinformation is intentional. And malinformation is not only intentional, but meant to harm. That's kind of the very broad way that I explain it. I don't find it all that meaningful, actually, to define it, because they all roughly come under fake news. They all are intended to deceive. It's a matter of degree. And your strategies for identifying them aren't going to be terribly different. So while it's important for me as a librarian to know the difference, I don't think it's as important for anyone else to know, because they're still going to identify it. They still need to know it's not real. That's really the crux of what's going on.
Okay, next question. Do you have any evidence that your students take the skills that they learn into their local communities? And then a follow-up to that, do they help others identify fake news?
I don't know if they help others identify fake news. I teach a first-year seminar class. I have them for one semester. I can't really follow up very well, especially now. But I do have evidence that they do take the lessons to heart. I do have reflection statements showing that. And I've had students come back to me and say, hey, yeah, remember that? Remember you said that? Yeah. Where they caught a family member or a friend, and they diffused it and explained why what they were saying was false. So I do have at least anecdotal evidence that they are learning from this. I don't have a formal assessment yet, simply because of the way my class is structured.
How do you respond to people who may be hostile to what you have to say?
I've really only come across hostility once, and it wasn't particularly severe. Yes, there are people that are going to say that I'm a media shill. I think that was the term that was used. I am someone who is all about corporate media, and oh my God, can't you tell that this is all fake and you're being fed this information? And I have to explain that that's not what the evidence says. If I'm going to go with evidence-based scholarship, then I have to look at what the evidence is saying. And I also have to look at the quality of news that I'm receiving. That's when I point to the ethics handbooks as well, because here we have a well-defined structure of how news is collected, how news is distributed, and what say advertisers have, if any, what kind of influences are on the back end. With a alternative news source, which was the context in which this hostility came about, you don't really have that kind of fail-safe. You have one person, and they're doing their best in many cases, but at the same time, it's not the same level of It's not the same burden of care, I think is what I want to say. And that's what makes it difficult to discuss the difference between, like, you know, why do I go with mainstream news? Why do I trust it? It's still hard to explain. I'm still going to face that hostility no matter what. And again, you do the best you can. There is no perfect model. You just have to keep going.
Awesome, thank you. All right, we have several more questions, so thank you for pushing through all these, Katie. So the next one is, do you talk to IUE students about how they can help educate their families and communities regarding fake news? And on top of that, do you explicitly encourage them to bring what they're learning back to their communities?
Absolutely, absolutely. Because it is a community. I do explain to them that, you know, like I said, it's a first year class. They're coming out of high school. They're coming from one experience to another. There's a major transition. They are relying on their communities more than ever for support at this time. It's a transition. So absolutely, I'm telling them to take it back. I'm telling them, you know, email me. I'm telling them to send me their stories and I will help them fact check. I had a student researcher a couple years back for a project that where we were trying to come up with an assessment of political bias and fake news. So yes, there is a continuation of this, and I do encourage them to develop research projects. We have Student Research Day on our campus where anyone can submit a project and present their findings. We have other opportunities on a regional campus level as well. So yeah, I do tell them to keep pursuing this.
Great, thank you. And then the next question, this one's from Diane, and Diane, correct me if I am misphrasing your question. Thinking about the digital divide, how are disinformation and misinformation, and I believe this is supposed to be impacting the digital divide, and Diane, correct me if that should be impacted by, but I believe it's impacting the digital divide.
The digital divide affects all types of information, whether it's real or not. When you don't have access to information, you have access to bad information more often than not. You have access to what you can get. Social media is the primary source of information for rural communities because Facebook is faster to load and doesn't require all this infrastructure. You have a cell phone, you get a data plan, and Facebook will load on 3G. So that's what you have. You take the information you have. And we're starting to see a migration away from things like television news and radio, which means that once again, you're dealing primarily with internet access and internet news, which is more instantaneous and provides you with, again, that bubble effect. You feel like you're part of a community that other media outlets don't replicate. So all news is impacted by the digital divide, all of it, and it affects rural communities and seniors more than anyone else. So I would say that it's really more of a blanket statement saying that it impacts all of it, and it impacts it negatively by restricting access in general, good or bad.
Okay, shifting over to SIFT, with undergraduates, do you use SIFT for evaluation over other methods,
I do.
and why?
I do, because SIFT is a lot quicker. Like, I've used the CRAP method before, but it doesn't encourage the kind of critical thinking. Like, if I tell you, think about the authority, you know, who's the author? They'll look at an author, so that they'll pull up a paper from the American College of Pediatricians, which is a fringe radical group. Their website looks really pretty. And they'll cite that as their source. Oh, look, it's the American College of Pediatricians. Of course they're legitimate. What a great name. So CRAP doesn't give you that investigative part. It doesn't encourage you to do lateral reading. It doesn't encourage you to dig beyond the website itself. That's why I like SIFT so much more. It actually forces you to do a bit more work. And then once you really figure it out, the average time that it takes a fact checker to fact check a claim is between 60 to 90 seconds. And I tell my students this, I'm like, you can get that good. And it doesn't take that much time.
Okay, thank you. Next question, do you have your class syllabus posted anywhere? People are interested in that and seeing it.
Um, it's usually in Canvas, but I can post it. I can make it available.
Great. So the next question is, do you teach about implicit bias as it relates to fake news?
I will be teaching about implicit bias coming up with this term. We haven't had a diversity coordinator on our campus for a while. We've had a diversity committee, and I've been part, and I have had implicit bias training. But I will say that I feel confident only in the last year that I would be able to present that information to my students. So yes, we're adding that this year.
And building on that question, do you challenge students to determine their own biases when you discuss bias?
Yes. Yes, actually, I'm going to be doing something. Last year I did the human library, which allows people from the community who represent a variety of identities to speak on an individual basis. It's more like small conversation tables. So I brought in a person who identified as asexual. I brought in a disabled woman. I brought in a survivor of sexual trauma. I brought in people of different religious identities. I brought a person who had been struggling with mental illness her entire life. And they were willing to speak with my students on a small group basis, 3 to 4 students at a time, talking about who they are and what they represent. And my students could ask any questions they wanted. My speakers for that were trained. Human Library is an international organization. It's with a number of different events and projects going on at any given time. It's been around about 20 years, but it is the first human library conducted in my community, which is what made it really unique. And that did force implicit bias thinking. And the reflection statements from my students were very much along those lines. I didn't know that I thought this. I had this trepidation before coming into this. I thought this, but now I think that. It was really eye-opening. And because of COVID-19, I can't do it again this year. I'd love to. It was really powerful. And those who were involved would have already said they would come back, my speakers. Unfortunately, I have to come up with a different solution, hence the reason I'm working with a diversity coordinator this year.
Awesome, thanks, Katie. And then one more question, do you teach about algorithmic bias?
You know, I've only just started researching algorithmic bias. I know it exists, and I know why it exists, but I'll be honest, it's something I need to catch up on. So I am still working on my own information bank on that. I do date a mathematician who is willing to help me with this. And so it is something that I need to be a bit more hip to. So I apologize, I don't have a better answer than that.
All right, that's okay. And that's the last question that we have so far. People are saying in the chat that they're really amazed at human libraries and they think they're really cool. So that's a really fun event. If anyone else has any questions for KT, please feel free to put them in the chat. We have this room open for a little while longer, as long as KT is willing to stick around. And yeah, thank you, everyone. Is the best way to get in touch with you, KT, email? People are interested in the fact opinion game.
Absolutely. The email is the best right now. I'm working from home, but I do have access to a lot of my files available online. So yeah, that's probably the best way to do it. Again, it prints out on 11 by 14 for the board itself, and the cards print out on 8.5 by 11. So you should be able to do it with a standard printer.
This was such an interesting presentation. Thank you again, Katie, for doing all this. This was
sure.
really
Thanks for inviting me. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah.